So I think we can get down to the substance of why we're all here. As all of you know, the resolution that's going to be debated is as follows. Eating meat is neither ethical nor healthy. So we're going to have an affirmative team and a negative team. We have the debate format written up on this whiteboard right here. Note that both sides will get 4 speeches, and in the middle of the debate, there will be 2 sessions of cross-examination where the 2 sides can ask each other questions and sort out some differences. So there's going to be some folks keeping time. So 30 seconds before speech is over, you're going to hear this noise. And once the speech is actually over, you'll be hearing this noise. And that'll be our way of holding folks accountable time-wise. Once you hear that alarm, then you'll be able to finish your thought, but we ask you to wrap it up. Cool. Now we can go ahead and introduce the debaters. So I'm going to start by introducing the affirmative team. That is the folks that are going to be arguing that meat is not ethical and not healthy. So we'll start with Bruce Friedrich right here. Bruce is the executive director of the Good Food Institute, which focuses on disputing animal agriculture by promoting plant-based and cultured alternatives. Bruce graduated magna cum laude, Order of the Coif, from the Georgetown University Law Center, and also holds degrees from Johns Hopkins University and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Bruce has held leadership roles for the past 2 decades at top nonprofit organizations working against animal agriculture. So let's everybody give Bruce a hand. Sitting next to Bruce is John Mackey. John Mackey is the co-founder and co-CEO of Whole Foods Market, and he has led the natural and organic grocer to a $15 billion Fortune 500 company with more than 435 stores and 91,000 team members in 3 countries. While devoting his career to helping shoppers satisfy their lifestyle needs with quality natural and organic foods, Mackey has also focused on building a more conscious way of doing business. Mackey has been recognized as one of Fortune's world's 50 greatest leaders, Ernst & Young's Entrepreneur of the Year overall winner for the U.S., Institutional Investor's Best CEO in America, Barron's World's Best CEO, MarketWatch's CEO of the Year, and Fortune's Business Person of the Year. So everybody give a warm welcome to John. And second, we have the team that will be negating the resolution that is arguing that meat is healthy and ethical. First, here we have Jack Boffa, who's a sophomore studying computer science and originally from Hanover, New Hampshire. He is an active member on the Stanford Debate Team. Let's give it up for Jack. And next to Jack, we have Jimmy Zhou, who is a sophomore also studying public policy and originally from Arcadia, California. Jimmy is also an active member of the Stanford Debate Team. Let's give it up for Jimmy. Quick disclaimer, none of the views that are mentioned here tonight represent the views of the Stanford Debate Society.
So Bruce is going to talk about the ethical environmental aspects. I'm going to focus on the health aspects. And I'm going to make a case against high animal food diets. First of all, you have to understand meat consumption has radically gone up in the United States. We've increased 60% in the last 100 years, 70% since 1940. It's exploding around the world as people become more affluent. They want more calorie-dense foods. They want more protein, and so animal food consumption is going crazy all around the planet right now. We're cheese addicts. 100 years ago, people consumed about 3 pounds of cheese per capita. In the U.S., we're now at 33.5 pounds. Bruce and I don't eat any, so somebody else has eaten like 67 pounds of cheese. I submit that all major studies show an increase in all-cause disease and death from heavy animal foods diets. There are no major studies of plant food-centered diets that show similar effects. Let's take a look first at red meat consumption. So the Harvard School of Public Health followed 120,000 people for 22 to 28 years, and they found a 13% increased risk of dying from every serving of unprocessed red meat, which is about 2 to 3 ounces. So if you're chowing down a 16-ounce steak every day, then you're talking about an increase of about, 65%, 70% increased risk of all-cause death. And then processed red meat, there's a 20% chance of increased risk per serving. Recently, you probably read in the media, in 2015, the World Health Organization, which is not influenced by the dairy and meat industries, officially classified processed red meat as a potent Group 1 carcinogen, right up there with tobacco and asbestos, also Group 1 carcinogens. This is an interesting study that was done on Swedish women. Back, 43,000 women were 30 to 49 years of age, were followed for about more than 15 years. And what's very interesting, this was for checking for cardiovascular disease. And here we can see that overall, an increased risk of cardiovascular events occurred for those who followed or adhered to a low-carb, high-animal food diet. And the results are fascinating because they show a gradual and consistent increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular death, the higher the consumption of animal products and the reduction in carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are plant foods. Their conclusion, low carbohydrate, high protein animal diets are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Here you can see it laid out in graph form. So you can see that 60% for those of you, the Swedish women who ate low amounts of animal protein had far less risk for cardiovascular disease. This was a study published fairly recently in 2014. It followed 6,000 people in the 50 to 65-year age range for 18 years. There was a 400% increase risk for cancer death compared to those who ate lower amounts of animal protein. There was an incredible 73 times increased risk for developing diabetes in the higher animal protein group, 23 times increase of risk for those in the moderate animal protein group compared to the lower protein group. And there was a 75% increase overall mortality over the 18-year period in the high animal protein group. Here you can see just on the cancer risk, it's incredible, 4x. And these low protein doesn't mean no protein, it just means small amounts. Colon cancer. There's now over 1,000 studies have concluded that red meat and processed meat increases the risk of colon cancer, and that a whole plant-based diet consisting of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and beans decreases the risk of colon cancer. As a result of these studies, the World Cancer Research Fund and the American Institute for Cancer Research recommend eating a plant-based diet. Here we can see the great research that was done by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. 87 countries participated, sent quality data, and animal food consumption was correlated with 12 types of cancer with a lag of 15 to 25 years. And interestingly, the overwhelming amount of the countries participating were using pasture-raised, not feedlot animal products. Look at the breast cancer results. These are 15 to 25 years later. Those who ate the most animal foods had by far the highest incidences of breast cancer. Let me make a quick case for the whole foods plant-based diet, consisting of whole grains, vegetables, fruits, beans, nuts, seeds. One of the myths that's out there is, anybody that's plant-based vegan always gets the question, where do you get your protein? Where do you get your protein? Where do you get your calcium? And there's an assumption behind that question that somehow or another plant-based diets are nutrient deficient, when actually the opposite is the case. That on a calorie basis, you can see that the least nutrient-dense foods that you can eat are refined grains, sugars, and oils, highly processed foods. But after that, the animal foods are the least micronutrient-dense foods that we can eat. And you can see as you go up the chart that it's the green vegetables, leafy greens, beans, non-starchy green vegetables. These are the most micronutrient-dense foods that we can possibly eat. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the great studies that have been done on the blue zones. by Dan Buettner, which societies live the longest, and they've identified 5 that have outstanding longevity, the most centenarians per capita in the society. Okinawan, Ikaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya, Costa Rica, and Loma Linda, California. And every one of these societies eats a plant-based diet, 90+% plant-based diet. Okinawans are very fascinating. This is one of the longest-lived cultures in the world. 70% of their calories come from sweet potatoes. 85% are coming from carbohydrates. They're 96% vegan. They only eat about 4% animal foods. Another one of the Blue Zone societies is in Loma Linda, California, where the Seventh-day Adventists are concentrated. Here you can see that from a body mass index standpoint, the vegans are the thinnest, then the vegetarians, then the omnivores. And most interesting, the vegan Adventists who ate nuts and seeds, exercised, and didn't smoke are the longest-lived cohort ever discovered in modern times. The males, on average, live 14 years longer than the average Caucasian American, and the females live 10 years longer. And you can see their risk for cancer, heart disease are significantly lower. Dean Ornish proved that you can reverse heart disease on a vegetarian, starch-based, low-fat diet. I don't know why this hasn't completely changed the world, because no other diet has ever been proven to reverse heart disease. Ornish proved it. He thought he would change the world, but he's largely been ignored. Here you can see Caldwell Esselstyn has done similar work, and you can see amazing results based on a whole foods, 100% whole foods plant-based diet, no refined oils, sugars, refined carbohydrates, low fat, and those who followed this diet consistently reversed their heart disease. So here's my challenge to my debating opponents. Where are the studies and who are the doctors that are curing heart disease, ending diabetes, and autoimmune diseases based on a meat-based diet? Thank you very much.
All right, great. So yeah, thanks so much to John for that great information, and thanks very much to Bruce for being here. And I'm really excited to talk about some of the reasons why meat consumption actually can be very healthy, not only just not unhealthy, but can actually actively benefit your health in many different ways. So just a roadmap of kind of what I'll be discussing. First of all, what does healthy actually mean, and what do you need to do in order to be healthy in whatever sense you define that word? Secondly, what are some reasons people think that commonly that meat is unhealthy, and are those reasons valid? And thirdly, what are some reasons that meat is in fact very beneficial for your health? So yeah, to go right into it, food for thought. What does health actually mean? So as we've seen over time, there have been a lot of different conceptions of what health actually is. So these are government infographics over time, starting from the 40s up to now, about essentially what the different variations of being healthy are. So initially we see, there were 7 food groups, and butter was considered very important in 1943 because there were butter shortages at the time. Then 1956 saw a much simpler one, just meat, milk, vegetables, bread. Between 1956 and now, we've had the food pyramid, which was, again, more complex, more similar to the earlier one. And now it's broken down into some simpler categories once again. So over time, it's clearly there've been a variety of opinions on what health actually is and what you should do to be healthy. So you just need to consider that when you have a debate regarding what to do to be healthy. Then another factor is, what do you do? What do you spend most of your time doing? Do you spend most of your time eating chips and watching TV, or do you spend your time running marathons? These are important questions because what you actually do and the ways you burn calories and go about your day very much affect what foods will be healthy and what will be unhealthy. Certain diets require nutrients from different things depending on what you're actually using that energy for. Finally, the concept of health has changed over time. So yeah, as I said, and there's over time, though, been an emphasis on balance. So that's very important. And it depends on what you do. And it also depends on what your goal is. Is your goal to lose weight? Is your goal to build muscle? All of these things very much affect what the purpose of your eating food is, and therefore what you should actually be eating. All right, so now to get into some arguments that we see against meat consumption a lot. Causes heart disease, causes cancer, and over time we see vegans and vegetarians are just generally more healthy. So these are the most common arguments against meat consumption, and many of which we heard from John also. But there are actually some issues with some of these arguments, which we'll see. So first of all, a common argument. Meat has saturated fat. Saturated fat increases LPL cholesterol in the blood, and LPL cholesterol in the blood clogs your arteries and causes heart disease. And this has been believed for a while, and there were many studies that essentially showed this, but not all meat, so first of all, not all meat has saturated fat. There's a lot of choices of meat that you can eat that do not contain saturated fat, such as white meat from chicken breast or turkey. Also, lean cuts of beef often do not have saturated fat in them and are much more healthy, so they ignore that issue. But furthermore, saturated fat isn't actually bad. The link between saturated fat and LDL cholesterol has actually been shown to be false. There were many studies showing that. Looks like my slides got cut off. But a randomized study over 8 years, for example, showed that there was in fact no link between cholesterol and heart disease. So it showed that essentially people who stuck to a diet of no saturated fat versus people who continued eating normally, they showed no differences in developing heart disease over time. Overall, the only fat that's been shown to be bad is trans fat. But by ignoring processed meats, you avoid your intake of trans fat. So that doesn't end up being a problem. So does meat cause cancer? Processed meat almost certainly does. And the World Health Organization report that John was talking about got to that. It was definitely shown that processed meat has about an 18% increase of causing cancer, the chance of that. Now, red meat, unprocessed red meat, they actually said in the report is unknown whether or not it is a carcinogen. So they are not sure on red meat yet. And all other meat, there are many other types of meat besides processed and unprocessed red meat. White meat, lean cuts of beef, and all sorts of things like that do not cause cancer. There's been no link to carcinogens in those types of meat. So, and then finally, you see a general trend that vegans and vegetarians are more healthy, sometimes have better longevity, things like that. But why? This has been shown to generally be because of health consciousness. People who make the decision to switch to veganism and vegetarianism are often more health conscious people who will exercise more, reduce intake of processed meats, not smoke, things like that. And these are the factors that actually cause, reduced longevity and other factors in people who eat meat. So it is a case of correlation does not equal causation, because when they actually studied whether essentially vegetarians and meat eaters had any difference in these factors, there was no difference when they controlled for other lifestyle choices. So this essentially means that what was causing this is everything else in people's lives who vegetarians and vegans essentially are better at managing. So the bottom line is don't eat processed meat and you'll be fine. So yeah, processed meat is the one that actually causes, is able to cause cancer, has bad saturated fats and bad trans fats, the types that can actually lead to heart disease and all that. There are many types of meat, however, that don't contain these things, white meat, chicken, and all sorts of things like that, that are perfectly healthy to ingest. So, beyond this, though, meat is in fact very healthy. And I'm essentially just going to give you a long list of nutrients that you can find in meat that you can't find elsewhere, because that is why meat is healthy. So, protein. Protein is probably the obvious one that you think of when you think of something that's in meat that you need. Protein is essential for development, muscle building, and everything your cells do. Your body is able to synthesize some proteins, but there's a lot that have to be acquired through food. And there's the protein that's in vegetables is different from animal-based protein sources because animal-based proteins contain all of these amino acids, whereas ones from vegetables do not, and they often lack certain of these components. Furthermore, we have DHA and EPA. These are active forms of omega-3. The body actually can't convert ALA, the plant form of omega-3, to an active form as easily. So it is very difficult to get these through plants. And deficiency can give you all sorts of adverse effects on mental health and brain function. And it's actually been shown that in pregnant women, it's not very good for the baby to be deficient in these. Creatine and carcinogen help build muscle and improve brain function. So they're very important for these reasons. And again, these are things that are only found in meat. And finally, vitamin D3. It's much more effective than the plant form, which is D2. You can get D3 from the sun, but a lot of people stay indoors, so that causes vitamin D3 deficiency. So eating meat is a great way to make up for that. And vitamin D3 is very important in preventing things like osteoporosis, cancer, heart disease, all sorts of stuff. I had another slide on that, but nope, I don't know where that went. Sorry. Yes, so overview of all this. What is healthy for you is subjective. You have to base it off of your goals and what you're trying to do. But generally, it's agreed that balance is very important in your health. So to the essentially the dichotomy of, you can either have a plant-based diet or an animal-based diet is a false one, because it's very important to combine both of these things. And we're not saying in any way that not eating plants is a good diet, but if you're a professional athlete, you should probably eat meat because there's a lot of very important nutrients there. And even if you sit all day, there's many benefits to be gained from meat consumption. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Next up will be Bruce talking about ethics and environmental impacts of meat consumption.
Let's see if I can make this thing work. People hear me okay like this? Excellent. All right. I want to start by thanking the Stanford Center for Ethics in Society very much for hosting us. I want to thank Jimmy and Jack for agreeing to appear in the debate. John also for coming and being my debate partner. Thanks to all of you for staying, for coming in the first place, and then also for staying. And especially thank you to the Stanford people for animal welfare that put an awful lot of work into this event, and especially these guys. David Kay and Eitan Fisher. Aw, that's so nice. I love you too, David. Anyway, I want to start with a little bit of participation. Who here, when you're making decisions in your daily life, does things to try to make decisions that align with your environmental values? Okay, that's pretty much unanimity. And who thinks that if you can make a decision that helps animals as opposed to a decision that harms animals, we should go with the decision that helps animals? Yeah, okay. I should have maybe gone in the other direction. And okay, who's going to out yourself as an animal hater? And then finally, you have the opportunity to help somebody in global poverty. Who thinks that's probably the right thing to do? Yeah, of course. And that's what ethics is. According to Peter Singer in Encyclopedia Britannica, ethical is doing what's morally good or morally right. And we all just agreed that it's morally right to align our actions with our values where it has to do with the earth, animals, and the global poor. I'm going to contend that if you raised your hand in response to any of those three things, global poverty, the environment, or animals, then you will agree with me that eating meat is unethical. I want to talk first about the global poor. And this just makes intuitive sense. I weigh about 200 pounds. If I do nothing but lay in bed watching Jerry Springer reruns, I'm going to burn like 2,000 calories a day. Unless something exciting is happening on the screen, I'm then it ticks up a little bit, right? When I get excited. That same sort of thing is true for farm animals. Not that they lay in bed watching Jerry Springer reruns, but that the vast majority of what you feed to a chicken or a pig or a cow, the vast majority of what you feed to a farm animal, the animal expends simply existing. So the most efficient of the farm animals in turning crops into flesh are chickens. And it takes 9 calories into a chicken in the form of corn or wheat or sorghum or whatever you're feeding the chicken. It takes 9 calories in to get 1 calorie back out. It's a vastly inefficient and wasteful system. And this is actually the reason I adopted a vegan diet 28 years ago. I didn't want to waste so much food. This is the global envoy on food to the United Nations. His name is John Ziegler. And a number of years ago, it came out that 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat was being turned into biofuels. He called it a crime against humanity, that 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat was turned into biofuels, driving up the price of corn and wheat and causing people to starve. So who thinks that's a reasonable argument? So we've got some biofuels advocates in the audience, but a fair number of people think that's reasonable. 100 million metric tons, except the same Food and Agriculture Organization report found that 756 million metric tons were fed to chickens and pigs and other farm animals, and again, 90% plus of that completely wasted in the animals simply leading their lives. You add in soy, another 200 million metric tons of soy, and you're talking about 1/10 of a billion metric tons into biofuels, more than 1 billion metric tons into soy. If we care about the global poor, eating meat is unethical. But that's not, World Watch Institute, meat production is an inefficient use of grain. They basically connect the dots. The grain is used more efficiently when consumed directly by humans. Continued growth in meat output is dependent on feeding grain to animals, creating competition for grain between affluent meat eaters and the world's poor. But that's not the entirety of the relationship. It's not just the 9 calories in to 1 calorie out. It's also many extra stages of production. So, and this makes intuitive sense too. And it's true that getting vegan foods to the table, it requires energy and creates pollution. You have to grow the crops, you ship the crops to the factory, you turn them into Cheerios or beer or whatever other wonderful vegan food you're going to be eating. And that requires energy and it creates pollution. But if you're going to grow those crops to feed them to animals, well, now you're shipping them to the feed mill, and you're operating the feed mill. And then you're shipping the feed to the factory farm, and you're operating the factory farm. And then you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, and you're operating the slaughterhouse. It's like 3 or 4 extra stages of gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing 18-wheelers. It's factory farms, and we know what an environmental catastrophe they are. It's slaughterhouses, which are also an environmental catastrophe. So it's not just the inefficiency of the calories in, calories out. It's also an environmental nightmare. And the United Nations actually did a report called Livestock's Long Shadow, and they said that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale from local to global. Whatever the issue, the inefficiency that I was just talking about and the pollution and the waste, whether it's the smallest and most local or the largest and most global of environmental concerns, raising animals for food is one of the top 3 contributors. It contributes to problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And on the issue of climate change, raising animals for food contributes 40% more global warming than all forms of transportation combined. All the 18-wheelers, all the jumbo jets, all the cars, 40% more from raising animals for food. And on the climate change issue specifically, again, the most efficient of the meats is chickens, and chickens on a calorie per calorie basis create 10 times the climate change, 10 times more CO2 equivalent than wheat, and 27 times more CO2 equivalent than legumes like soy. If what you're looking for is protein calories, it gets even worse. They create 40 times more climate change on a protein calorie per protein calorie basis. So anytime we're choosing to eat animal products, we are basically creating vastly more pollution and incurring vastly more waste than if we were eating wheat or legumes directly. So if you care about the climate, and all of us I think do, if you care about the environment, and all of us do, eating meat is unethical. Finally, animals. Who would be willing to eat this cat? A couple people. No, I would. She is incredibly edible. Look at her. I just want to eat her up. No, my wife would beat you up if you tried to eat our cat. There were not many hands in the room willing to eat the cat. But as a society, we have this vast irrationality wherein we're not willing to eat a cat, but we are willing to eat a chicken. We're not willing to eat a dog, but we are willing to eat a pig. And good luck coming up with anything like a rational explanation for this bias. In fact, ethologists, people who study cognition, emotion, and behavior, tell us that chickens and pigs outperform dogs and cats in tests of behavioral and cognitive sophistication. My wife, again, she insists that the cats are like refusing to participate. The cats could, kick the chickens and the pigs' asses if they wanted to. But the dogs are trying. We've known for a long time, Charles Darwin taught us, that other animals are more like human beings than they're unlike us. They're made of flesh and blood and bone just like we are. They have the same 5 physiological senses that we do. And biologically, they feel pain in the same way and to the same degree. The foremost living evolutionary biologist is Richard Dawkins. He denounces what he calls speciesist arrogance, this idea that human beings are the pinnacle of the of evolution, and says that other species of animal, they are our evolutionary cousins. And those of us who share our lives with dogs and cats, I think we know this to be true intuitively. This book, The Inner World of Farm Animals, talks about some of that ethological research I was talking about with regard to chickens and pigs. It also goes into fish and cattle, and I highly recommend it. The primatologist Jane Goodall wrote the introduction, and in that introduction she points out that farm animals feel pleasure and sadness, excitement and resentment, depression, fear, and pain. They are far more intelligent than we ever imagined. They are individuals in their own right. And this is how we treat them. This is how we treat them. It's just one example. Chickens are crammed tens of thousands of them into sheds. They're bred and they're drugged to grow 7 times as quickly as they did just 50 years ago. But their hearts and their lungs and their limbs can't keep up. So they suffer from astronomical rates of lung collapse, heart failure, and crippling leg deformities. Some researchers at the University of Arkansas, poultry researchers, they said that if a human baby grew as quickly as a modern broiler chicken, she would weigh 650 pounds before her first birthday. Imagine the agony of a child at 650 pounds before her first birthday. Their lives are categorized by unmitigated misery. And that's what we're supporting when we choose to eat animal products. If we oppose cruelty to animals, eating meat is unethical. So in summary, just about everybody in the room said that that it's morally right to make decisions on behalf of the poor, on behalf of the earth, and on behalf of animals. If you're one of those people, then I hope you will agree with me that eating meat is unethical. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Next up is Jimmy. Nope. No, now it's working. Hi, everyone. So I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight and joining us for this debate. I also like to thank Bruce and John for joining us also and providing their wonderful arguments that I will have a lot of fun trying to think up on the spot of how to respond. So as we all know the resolution by now, Jack dealt with the health side of it. I'm going to deal with the ethics side of it. So to begin, I'd like to frame my approach to this debate about ethics. That we really should be looking for the ethical middle ground here, because the dichotomies in this debate are not useful, right? It's not all about like the affirmative being portrayed as eating meat is evil, or that everyone should be vegan automatically, or that like the negative side here is saying that everyone should have a steak at every single dinner, right? Like that's not productive to this conversation. Instead, what we really should be focusing on is the question of, can there be an ethical way to eat meat? And in order to address this question, I think that we must look at the fact that, well, we as a negative will agree that a lot of the factory farms and what's going on, the practices in there are not great, so to speak loosely, and that like we should not be supporting these practices. But perhaps we can find an alternative way in which we can still be able to eat meat and still pursue it in an ethical fashion. And the goal of this debate here is to inform you, right? Like, we believe that this debate is like an opportunity for you to be exposed to new ideas and different positions in order for you to make the best decision for yourself. As Jack said, that health is a lifestyle question about yourself. Same with ethics, right? That the ethics of this of meat should really depend on your own ethical views, and like Bruce said, require some sort of consistency with your own values and your actions. And so, again, like as I said, that the choice to eat meat is intensely personal, and at the end of this debate, I hope that this will somehow change your views or influence your views to develop a more complex position. So the outline is that we're going to go over 5 arguments. First is the act of eating meat. Second is the cultural imperialism of eating meat. The third is benefits of cow raising. Fourth, potential harms of vegetarianism. And 5 is meat of the future. So, in terms of this act of eating meat, Jack really wanted me to bring up this example, so I will humor him. But he wanted to talk about this cow being struck by lightning, which I do think is a very useful example in framing this debate about meat, because it brings up the question, is eating meat in and of itself the problem here, right? We look to this cow and see that, well, if the cow is dead, that like it hasn't really suffered, right? Like, we were not the result of its suffering. It was the lightning that killed it. Now it's just meat sitting there, right? If we eat this meat, we are able to take its nutrients. It can benefit us, enable us to do our tasks and live our life. Whereas if the meat was just sitting there, it would be wasted, right? Is this an example of where it's ethical or okay for it to be eating meat? And we believe,
yes, this is an example of where perhaps it would be more ethical than the factory farms that Bruce has been showing you in the past few slides. So, we realize that there's problems with this cow struck by lightning example, right? Like, it's not a reliable way to get meat. I can't just sit around waiting for a cow to be struck by lightning every time I want to eat a steak, right? And there's also problems in showing that, like the cow struck by lightning, there's difference in intentions when you're actually trying to kill an animal for meat. And doesn't deny the suffering that occurs when we kill an animal for meat. However, but I still think it ultimately does show an important point that not all meeting is the same. Some ways and situations are more ethical than others, and that's the goal of our side of this, is trying to find this middle ground in which we can find a more ethical way of approaching this. So in terms of the cultural imperialism, we think that eating meat, it's not something that you can create a universal maxim about, that eating meat is unethical. Because, for example, this group of people, who are they? They're the Inuit of the Canadian Arctic. And what do they eat? Mainly fish, seal, walrus, and whale meat, and almost no plant matter, because I imagine that's kind of hard to grow plants on ice. But it illustrates an important point, right? If we are to, perhaps in our Western society, that we can have these opportunities to have like Whole Foods or these markets in which we can grow meat, grow vegetables and have a sustainable vegan or vegetarian diet. For other people across the world, that's not necessarily sustainable for everyone, right? They live in areas where meat is perhaps their only source of nutrients. And who are we to say that their way of living is unethical or that they should be changing their life? Why is our necessarily why is the factory farming that Western society has created should be the cause of the destruction of their culture, right? Like, if we created the factory farms, who are we to now say that we should all stop eating meat and make them stop eating meat too and change their way of life? And just in case you think that this is like one example of people who survive on eating meat, it's not just an edge case. There are tons of other cultures across the world in which they mainly rely on eating meat for sustenance. And it also goes back, you can look to this as a cross application on the health side of this, is that there can be cultures, like there are entire cultures of people who are built on eating a meat-based diet. That there might be a misconception out there that eating a meat-based diet is problematic because you have a lot of friends who are vegetarian, but you don't have a lot of friends who just eat a steak every meal, right? Like, but that doesn't mean that eating a meat-based diet is unsustainable. I think these cultures are examples of that. So, getting into the third part of my argument is the benefits of cow raising. So it's kind of wondering what happens when we decide not to raise cattle. And I think in answering the first question, we have this case study of Australia. Australia is more than 70% grassland. It's rather dry. It's not very good for agriculture. And if we got rid of the cattle there, the land would be taken over by other wild animals. They're, I guess, considered rodents, such as goats and kangaroos in Australia, both of which would still release more GHGs. And that it would result in losing a major protein source for Australia and just food source in general. That realized that these areas where cow is being raised, where we have the option of having them grass fed, are just are areas where it's not very sustainable to have agriculture there, and that it's a better use of the land there, and would be able to in some areas like Australia a need for them to obtain their nutrients. The second question is, what are the greenhouse consequences of this meat production? And so I think this is a point in this debate where you see conflicting information. That we're going to tell you that cow ranchers can actually help save the planet because research has shown that carbon sequestration can happen on grasslands, even accounting for the methane and all other GHGs that animals release. And this is because that the distinction between what we view as sustainable cow raising and what Bruce talks about is the factory farms versus the grass-fed cow, free-range cow that we advocate as a possibility for being sustainable meat. And here is that this is perhaps the factory farming, if we got rid of factory farming, a stance that we as a negative agree with, that we would get rid of most of the arguments about meat. Because the soy and The soy and corn, which are mainly used to feed factory farms, it's not a problem with grass-fed cattle, and that we can be better addressing, be having a more sustainable meat production with grass-fed cattle. Specifically, because the critique, as I said, the critiques about meat production are focused on factory farms and not about the grass-fed cow that we are advocating for. And so in getting to this potential harms of vegetarianism, it's a similar theme, right? Like, the problems with meat production is that it's being done on mass scale. That meat production is, we need so much meat that we had to make these factory farms. Similarly with vegetables and crops, right? The massive amount of farming and agriculture that's going on is also hurting the environment. And it's not the choice of eating meat that's problematic. It's the scale of which we do it, right? Same with plants. And the soy and corn, or the fact that soy and corn are particularly water intensive, only proves to show that it spills over into blaming meat, right? If we, these factory farms are the primary sources of using the soy and corn as cattle feed. If we got rid of those, we wouldn't be using such intensive resources on meat production. We'd be using the grasslands that wouldn't be used anyway in order to be producing useful nutrients. And the truth is that while lots of other fruits and vegetables are as resources intensive as meat, there was a research study done at Carnegie Mellon in 2010 which showed that lettuce produces 3 times more GHGs than bacon. But a pound of bacon will provide a lot more nutritional value than a pound of lettuce. So in terms of the meat of the future, I think we really should be looking at this because it raises interesting questions. In 2013, there was the first lab-grown meat dish that was cost $330,000, not something that I think many of us could afford. But the costs are coming down and the innovation is going up. It provides a possibility for a future that we can eat this kind of meat in that it's grown in a lab. And there's not as no environmental damage. There's no suffering of animals. You're eating a ball of cells. But the question is, does that change the dimensions of eating meat? And I think that it does, and provides a possibility of us to engage, get closer to this middle ground of eating meat, in which we can better find out what is the best way to both protect animals, protect the environment, protect people who are poor, and still remain ethical. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. So next up, we're going to have our first cross-examination period. It's going to be the neg asking questions of the AF side. So that'll be Jimmy and Jack asking John and Bruce some questions.
So I guess our first question that we would like to ask is about regarding Bruce's last argument on the animals, that how we treat animals differently, we treat certain animals differently. It's kind of irrational for us to do that. Is the conclusion of that argument that animals are the same as humans, animals deserve all the same rights as humans?
Well, I mean, animals probably wouldn't make a lot out of the right to vote or the right to drive a car. But the argument is that where the interests are identical, then protection of those interests should be identical. So, for example, animals feel pain in the same way and to the same degree that we do. So, as much as we can, we should be trying to avoid causing them pain, or at least unnecessary pain. I mean, that's the basic animal rights argument. For our purposes, for the is eating meat ethical or unethical, it's just a question of when you have 2 choices and one of them causes an animal harm and one of them does not cause an animal harm, shouldn't we go with the choice that does not cause an animal harm? So you don't have to believe in animal rights to say, yes, I wouldn't eat a dog, I wouldn't eat a cat, and that intuition, I think, speaks well of us. There's no difference between eating a dog or a cat, a pig or a chicken.
Yeah, so a question I was kind of interested to hear the answer to, because it gets at kind of a lot of these issues pretty well on the ethics side, is suppose for whatever reason there was a tribe of people, a village that only had meat as their primary source of nutrition. So they have no access to vegetables or any other food source, be it like they can't digest it or it's, unarable land like the Inuit. Do you think it's unethical for them to eat meat?
No, and I'm also down with the lightning strike scenario, but maybe aesthetically objectionable. But no, I definitely am thinking of is eating meat ethical as a question that everybody in this room is asking themselves as they walk out of this room. What should I be eating? And is eating meat ethical for me? So if there are people here who aren't here because you're actually in, you're Inuit and you're someplace else, or if the Inuit are, watching this video or something, or if you do happen across, has anybody here happened across an animal who was hit by lightning?
I looked up it in the news. It's actually quite common.
Yeah, roadkill is another option, and as long as you don't swerve to hit the animal, then probably the ethical objection, at least from the animal protection standpoint, is gone there too.
So is that time up? Yeah.
I guess we swap.
All right.
Well, so my question is that you guys made a statement about, I have a ton of questions, but I can see that I'm going to go before we get too far here. You were talking about, vegans and vegetarians make healthier choices, and that more likely explains their outcomes. How do you deal with the Seventh-day Adventist study? Because the Seventh-day Adventist study is a spiritual community. People don't smoke. They don't drink. There are communities of faith. There are communities of family. They exercise regularly. They have many healthy habits. The thing that sets the different Adventists apart is some are vegans, some are vegetarians, and some are omnivores. How do you explain the much better outcomes the vegans have in those communities when everything else has been corrected for?
Well, I'm not completely familiar with the study, so I don't. I'm not entirely sure which types of meat they were eating. I would say that, as I said in my presentation, processed meats are definitely very unhealthy. They have trans fat. They've been determined to be a carcinogen, and things like that. And to some extent, some unprocessed red meat can also be bad. So I don't know if they were perhaps eating that. We also have the NIH study that was saying that for a control group randomized over about 8 years, we didn't see there weren't any differences. So I don't know, maybe it's cultural or something. But yeah, I think it would depend on what kind of meat was being eaten and also where specifically this was taking place.
All right, I have a two-part question. Part one is, did I hear correctly that you are not defending any of the meat sold in the Stanford cafeteria or any of the restaurants around here? That's part one. So you agree that all of that meat is unethical, I think. And I guess part two is, if the answer to that is no, which of your arguments apply to any of the meat that is close to 100% of what everybody here is if they're eating meat is consuming?
Right. So one of the things I know about the Stanford cafeterias or dining halls are that they do label their beef as always being 100% grass-fed, which I think is part of our argument as a more sustainable style of eating beef. As for the rest of the meat on campus, I can't honestly say I know, but I also say that the first comment that you made about people making food decisions based on taste, convenience, and price still holds very true for me.
Yeah, it'll just go off in the middle.
Yeah, affirmative, negative, negative, affirmative.
I think we share this speech, though. I don't know. It doesn't really matter, but.
Did we get something wrong?
Oh, you're going last? Okay, then I guess it's you. I'm next. Yeah. Okay.
So wait, so this is gonna be ethics, right?
It's going to be both.
Both.
Throwing your curveball.
Apropos of nothing, did people hear that Bill Gates bought the Seattle Times this morning? He buys it every morning. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to cover the health, and then I'm going to cover the ethics, and hopefully I'll go fairly linearly in response to the arguments that have been made thus far. The first thing I want to point out is that cancer, I don't think they addressed the cancer issue other than to point to one study. And I will just say that the largest epidemiological study that's ever been done, as well as the linear progression that you saw that John shared, shows that cancer rates start going up from zero animal product consumption. And the foremost epidemiological researcher living is T. Colin Campbell. He wrote this book, The China Study, and it shows a linear increase in cancer rate as animal product consumption goes up from zero. Dr. Campbell says the ideal amount of animal protein in your diet is zero. Similarly, the only two researchers who have ever unclogged people's arteries, heart disease kills about half of Americans. The only two researchers ever to prevent heart disease with a diet did it with a low-fat vegetarian diet. So on the American Heart Association moderation diet, which is basically what they're recommending, on the moderation diet, people's heart disease gets worse just a little bit more slowly, to which Dr. Esselstyn points out, it's like pouring less gasoline on a fire. Maybe less gasoline is better than more gasoline, but why not stop pouring gasoline on the fire? We know that animal product consumption, again from zero, is linked to heart disease. And then finally, as John pointed out, the Adventist Health Study, they controlled for all other health factors, drinking, coffee, sleep, everything else, and they found that the healthiest Adventists were the vegan Adventists. They had the lowest rates of heart disease, cancer, obesity, and they lived the longest. The American Dietetic Association, not a bastion of vegan advocates, nevertheless, they looked at all of the all studies that have been done, all of the research. They said vegetarians have lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, and obesity than meat eaters, and that vegetarian diets have health benefits, not just in the prevention of disease, but they can actually unclog people's arteries, they can get people off their diabetes medicine, they can help them to lose weight. Eating meat is unhealthy. On the environmental issue, how many people in this room would go to your refrigerator, take out 9 plates of pasta, throw them in the trash, and eat 1 plate of pasta? I mean, that's what you're doing every time you choose to eat animal products, and it's extraordinarily wasteful, and it's directly linked to global poverty. If you care about the global poor, eating meat is unethical. On the environment, again, chicken is 27 times more polluting even than legumes. Beef goes way, way up. And according to the foremost think tank in Europe, it's generally called Chatham House. It's the Royal Institute for International Affairs, I think, but Chatham House. They point out that grass-fed, from a global warming standpoint, is even worse. So normal beef is something like 300 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per calorie. Chicken is 52 grams of carbon dioxide, 54 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per calorie. Legumes like soy, 2 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per calorie. So each time we are making a choice about what we want to eat, if we're choosing to eat animal products, we're eating something that requires vastly more resources, causes vastly more pollution, including vastly more greenhouse gases. When we think about climate change, we generally think in terms of, like, the big bugaboo is automobiles, and the bigger the automobile, the worse the automobile is for climate change. So I thought it was interesting a couple of years ago when Environmental Defense pointed out that if every American skipped 1 meal of chicken per week, 1 meal per week, and substituted vegetarian foods instead, the carbon dioxide savings would be the same as taking more than 500,000 cars off U.S. roads. I mean, think about if you substituted every meal. I mean, and chicken is the least polluting. Think about if you substituted every meal of chicken and pork and beef and substituted legumes and wheat. Huge climate change savings. If we care about the environment, eating meat is unethical. And then finally, Percy Shelley said in explaining his vegetarianism, he said, "I want no part of anything I can't write a pleasant poem about." I'm not a poet, I can't write a pleasant poem about anything. But applied to basic integrity, I really like this concept. Everybody in this room could take part in every aspect of getting plant-based foods to the table. Absolutely no inherent moral qualms to any aspect of beans and grains and fruits and vegetables. But I would venture that nobody in this room would want to spend an afternoon slicing chickens' throats open, or pigs' throats open, or cattle throats open. And I'm not showing you the most gruesome images or the most gruesome videos, but most people don't even, you don't even like to think about it, right? You don't want to see it. You don't want to do it. So where is the integrity? Where are the ethics in entering into this mercenary relationship wherein we're paying other people to do something that is completely unnecessary and we wouldn't do it ourselves? Not only would we not do it ourselves, we don't even want to see it or think about it. Ethically speaking, I think it's indefensible to enter into that sort of a mercenary relationship. So if you oppose unnecessary cruelty, eating meat is unethical. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. And I can tell you that I adopted a vegan diet 28 years ago. I was 18 years old. I grew up in Oklahoma, where the food groups in Oklahoma, at least in my high school, they were McDonald's Big Macs and Dairy Queen Blizzards. That's like what we ate. And the first time somebody said to me, I don't eat meat, I thought he had a disease. What do you mean you don't eat meat? It's like, I don't breathe oxygen. What? And it was because I had not challenged myself to ask what is happening behind the scenes. What are the inputs into meat that I'm not thinking about? And we all know that it is just as wrong to pay somebody to commit a murder as it is to commit the murder yourself. It's more wrong. Well, that's what we're doing in all three of these areas. If you're choosing to eat meat, you are entering into a relationship wherein 90% of the calories that went into your food are wasted. Drives up the price of cereals, leads to global poverty. You're entering into a relationship wherein vastly more climate change is happening because of your decision. Regardless of whether you are personally participating, you are responsible for it. And you're paying other people, factory farming or not, to treat animals abysmally and to kill them for you for something as inconsequential as a momentary palate preference. If you ask me, that's unethical. Thank you.
Great. All right, thanks very much. Yeah, so I don't actually have a PowerPoint for this one, so I'm just kind of going to be talking. But in my last speech, I didn't get to really go over what John had said, so I just want to cover some of those issues. So yes, in a choice between an animal-only and a plant-only diet, meat is unhealthy for a lot of reasons. And that's because you are eating one or the other to the exclusion of the other one. If you do a plant-only diet, you exclude a lot of very important nutrients. So you will have protein deficiency, B12 deficiency, and a lot of health risks that are very possible when you do this. Similarly, if you only eat animals, only eat meat, then you have a problem because you're excluding a lot of very other important nutrients, such as, grain, fruit, vegetables, and things like this. So yes, we agree that if you are only choosing between these two possibilities of eating only meat or only plants, then yeah, there's a lot of downsides to eating only meat. But this is a false dichotomy because we can eat both. We can make the decision to balance our diet and, eat some vegetables and some plants and also some meat to get a combination of nutrients that's very important for our body. And we can create a balanced diet, between B12, D3, protein, get all of those nutrients from meat, while also getting all of the very important nutrients you need from plants. So yeah, that's very important to keep in mind, because a lot of this is kind of saying, oh, you have to go one way or the other. But no, there's a way to combine both options. Vegan diets are very healthy because you get a lot of nutrients that come from those. And similarly, you can have a very healthy diet based on meat because of a lot of nutrients that come from meat. But the best diet is going to be one that combines both best sides of the world. So you have both of those things, and that's a very good way to eat. So then John also addresses a lot of things about the negative impacts of eating meat. But a lot of this pertains to processed meat. So yes, and we agree processed meat is bad. Processed meat has been shown to have trans fat, has been shown to be a carcinogen, very likely. And there's a lot of downsides to the eating of processed meat because specifically of the processes that go into creating it and developing the meat. And similarly, grilled meats, a lot of the time, have carcinogens on them that come from grilling. But if you remove the charred parts from the meat, then it can be still very healthy. So yes, there does exist a diet based on meat that's unhealthy. If you eat all of the very unhealthy meats, you will have an unhealthy diet and be more likely to develop problems and complications that occur because of that. I can also give you an example of a very unhealthy plant-based diet. If you eat purely poison ivy, then you will not have a very healthy diet because that is not a good plant to eat. So it goes both ways. So you have things that are very bad to eat in terms of meat that will ultimately, if you continue to eat them, be very bad for your health. But what we can do is create a diet based on very healthy meats that are good to eat. Lean chicken, if you remove fat, can be very healthy to eat and provides all of the nutrients that you get from and exclusively from meat. So that's a very important thing to include in your diet. Similarly, lean cuts of beef have not been shown to have any adverse effects. You can also eat venison. There's all sorts of wild game that are very healthy to eat. Additionally, pork, not any adverse health effects there at all. So all of these things are very important to include in your diet. And all of these things together, when you eat meat healthily, if you take just a very balanced approach to that, then you'll be able to create a diet that is based on meat that is healthy. So yeah, there are many ways to eat meat unhealthily, and there are many ways to eat plants unhealthily. So you just have to combine them and approach your diet efficiently. So again, John also mentioned just longevity generally, and how 95% vegan cultures have greater longevity. And yeah, there are certain types of meat that if you exclude will be able to benefit your health. But those were 95% vegan cultures. They're still getting the 5% meat, and therefore still getting all of the vitamins and nutrients that come from that meat. So they still have access to those nutrients and will not be deficient in those. And therefore, they're still gaining the health effects of meat. So John is actually showing us that there's a great combination of meat and vegetarian diets when in unison, combined together, creates very good longevity. So this is clearly a great way to eat if you combine those two things. If you go to 100% completely eliminating meat, that's when you start to develop complications such as deficiency in protein and vitamins and things like that. And a lot of times, like for example, today in the 21st century, we can supplement our diets with those vitamins. But in developing countries, things like that, you don't have that. You don't have that luxury, and also the fact that you need to take those supplements sometimes is another indicator that meat is very healthy. And yeah, and again, we also see that many meat-based diets are very sustainable in the long run, such as the Inuits, who lived entirely based off meat, and many other cultures as well, had very few plants in their diet, and was just as sustainable then. So the issue with trying to determine the health of meat consumption overall is that it's impossible to do. You can't actually decide one way or another, is meat consumption healthy, just based on that word. So like if we opened up a web browser right now, you would be able to find infinite studies on either side of every issue related to meat. Does meat cause cancer? Does meat not cause cancer? Meat causes heart disease? Meat doesn't cause heart disease. You can find infinite studies that support all of these sides of the issue. And we even saw this. John and I have contradicting studies on vegetarian versus meat consumption when all other factors are excluded. So you see that there's this great combination of studies. But let's review what we do know. You need protein. You need vitamin B12. You need vitamin D3 and lots of other nutrients that can only be found in meat. So this is a very clear indicator here that meat consumption is not only just not bad for you if you do it right, but it's actually very essential and very important to a balanced diet. Thank you. Oh, wait, do you go?
Yeah, 7, 5, 7, 7, 7.
Oh, negative, yeah.
Still working? Yeah, all right. All right. So in this final speech, I like to summarize what's been going on this round. And I think the most common theme that we've been finding from our position is that this theme of individuality. And the fact that from the beginning that we've shown you that like the resolution is not a universal maximum for everyone, right? That I think CrossX has shown that like reasonably that like other people, other cultures can still be eating meat and it's still ethical for them to do so, right? And therefore it goes back to for what's best for you, right? I think that's what we are strongly pushing for on our side of the debate. In the sense, as we have iterated in health and ethics, that what's best for your lifestyle and what your values are is going to be what's going to be the deciding factor of how you view this round. In terms of health, we've shown you that your decision of what lifestyle you want to choose will definitely impact what you want to eat. That the example of pro athletes or Division I college athletes needing the meat as a calorie-dense food, I think is especially relevant because it's true that like on their side of the debate, they have a lot of evidence about how people can live longer through vegetarian and vegan diets. But perhaps that's not the priority for you. Like if you are a pro athlete or an individual athlete or not D1 athlete, then you give a lot to your sport, and perhaps your sport is the important value in your life, right? That you will eat meat because it provides you the necessary nutrients in compact amount, on compact form, and that's why you will choose to eat meat and sacrifice the possible long life, right? I think it's true that like you can observe that like pro athletes don't live as long or are not the people who live the longest because they give so much and require so much of that out of their body. And so, which is going back to how whatever you choose in terms of health, again, goes back to you looking at you from your personal decisions. I think in terms of ethics, we have to go back to how your values. I think the problem with this is that when Bruce came up here and asked you all questions about how you felt about the environment, how you felt about poor people, how you felt about animals, is very much binary, right? Like you raised your hand if you cared, you didn't raise your hand if you didn't, right? Like, but that's not how it really is represented within your like personal decision making, right? That we place values, relative values on these things. That like we make these trade-offs. Perhaps we care about animals, perhaps we care about the environment, but do we care enough to make other sacrifices elsewhere? Like we still drive our cars, we don't always recycle, we don't always give to the charities, right? Like we do make these decisions in which we sacrifice these values even though we agree with them, right? So there's clearly this ranking here that we have to be establishing for ourselves in order to best determine what is ethical or what is best for the individual. And so I think coming down to this, that we look at the fact that if you came here today looking for a clear answer whether or not you should be eating meat or not, it's you make the decision. There's no silver bullet to this. There's no easy answer. That no one in here can really give you the answer to what you should be doing. That we can give you the information. Perhaps we learned today that like chicken produces 20 to 40 times more CO2 than than some legumes or soy, or in that like perhaps that grass-fed cow can actually function as a carbon sink. So there are benefits. There are both benefits to eating meat and harms to eating meat. And we're trying to illustrate to you as a negative that it's about your own search for this middle ground, right? That no one in this room can tell you what to do. That none of the four of us up here, and that you can make the choices based on what you feel is right. You can choose not to eat chicken, only eat chicken, only eat fish. Like there are many options. That even the spread of is not just eating meat, vegetarian, and vegan, right? There's a whole spread of decisions that you can make in terms of personal decisions of what type of meat you want to eat and why you're making those decisions is important. And that's why we're here to give you this information to teach you that whatever decision you make today should be an informed one based on what you believe the consequences are from your understanding and your own research. I think that's an important message for today. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes? Yes? No? Maybe? Don't start the clock yet. There we go. Better. Okay, so I'm going to end with a story, but I do have to address a few things before I get to the story. First of all, there's no evidence of protein deficiencies in vegans. That's just a common myth by meat eaters. In fact, it's almost impossible to have a protein deficiency if you're eating a whole foods diet, provided you don't have a calorie deficiency. Number two, they try to shift the argument to, well, we'll concede that processed meats are bad, but we won't concede that unprocessed meats are bad. And yet all the research I put up there shows that unprocessed meats lead to higher heart disease, more diabetes, and more cancer. It's not just the processed meats. And third, I will concede one point. If you were to eat a 95% plant-based diet, you would probably have in a whole foods 95% diet, you'd probably have very similar outcomes to someone that eats 100% plant-based. So if we could get everybody to go to 95%, that's great. I'll concede the rest of the argument to them. I will put this challenge. Jack says, well, I got my studies, you got your studies. I challenge you to find one long-term epidemiological study anywhere that shows better health outcomes the more animal foods you eat. I insist there are zero. Let me get to my story before I run out of time. So before he died, back in 2005, I got to know Milton Friedman. And my wife and I were taking Milton Friedman out to dinner in San Francisco, where he lived. We were going to a vegetarian restaurant called Green's. We went and picked him up at his house. He showed me his Nobel Prize in economics. And at that time, Milton and his wife Rose were both 92 years old. So he asked me, he said, so John, why are you a vegan? And I said, I'll tell you, Milton, if you can answer this syllogism adequately, I will stop being a vegan. But if you can't answer it, I expect you to change your diet. And he said, shoot. Okay, number one, if you eat animals, the animal necessarily has to die before you eat it. And in America, at least 99% of those animals were factory farm raised and had horrible lives. Number two, you don't need to eat animal foods to be healthy. In fact, the best health outcomes come the less animal foods that you eat. And I've presented a lot of evidence to that effect today. Number three, the reason we do eat animal foods is basically just cultural. We're enculturated to do so. We learn to eat it. We learn to enjoy it. It's part of our culture. And it just seems so natural and normal, right? Number four, can you justify causing the necessary death in your lifetime of thousands of animals? Thousands. That's what it adds up to be over your lifetime. Can you justify the necessary death of thousands of those animals, most who had horrible lives, simply for the pleasure of your palate? So I asked him that question. And he got very thoughtful. He looked at his watch, and he said, oh, we got to go to the restaurant. So we're driving over to the restaurant, and I'm driving, and he's telling me where to turn, and we get there, and we get to the restaurant. We get our menus out, and I'm thinking, oh, man, Milton Friedman, he's dodging my question. He's not going to answer the question. But I said, that's okay. He's 92 years old, right? So we're there, and he's looking at his menu, and he puts his menu down. And he says, Rose, I cannot adequately answer John's syllogism. I have no choice. From this point forward, I am a vegan. Rose throws her menu down and says, Milton, don't be utterly ridiculous. We're 92 years old. It's too late for us. Now, he died a year later, fell in a bathtub. I don't know whether he became a vegan or not, but you know one thing I do know? I'm looking around this room, and it's not too late for anybody in this room. You can still save the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of animals the rest of your life. You can make a difference. As Bruce and I have argued, it'll improve your health. It's a more ethical way to live in terms of the environment, in terms of animal cruelty, and in terms of world poverty. It is the ethical position we should take today. And yes, we'll concede if you're living up in the Arctic Circle. Yes, by the way, those Eskimos, the Inuits, they actually do get some plant foods. Do you know what they most crave? The first thing they eat when they can get the kill is they eat the caribou's intestines because they're full of green grass. They crave it. So yes, if you want to go live up there, we'll concede the point. But for everybody else, we won't concede it. Thank you very much.
Everybody, thank you again so much for coming. Let's give another hand for our debaters real quick. So there are a few things that are happening right now. We're going to have an abbreviated Q&A session. So if you have any questions, we have folks collecting the note cards, and we'll pass those up and pose those to John and Bruce. The other thing that's going on right now is we have some folks that are handing out Meatless Monday signups. We have over 1,500 Stanford students that have signed on to this Meatless Monday pledge to choose vegetarian foods one day a week. You guys have all heard all the arguments for and against that, so I'll let you decide if you want to sign up. But if you want to give reducing your meat consumption a chance, it'll be a great way to join 1,500 other Stanford students that have already done so. Awesome, thank you. Cool, so let's start with the questions. So we have one. How can increasing available grain or crops by eating less meat translate into providing food to the global poor? Is it through more foreign food aid, or are there more effective ways? So I guess that's probably for Bruce, but either Bruce or John could take it.
Yeah, I mean, the issue is we live in a global economy. And as the World Watch Institute was talking about, and now Oxfam America has also talked about, I mean, this is what did it for me. 28 years ago, I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet, and in Diet for a Small Planet, Frances Moore Lappé talks about exactly this. And she points out that in Ethiopia in the 80s, in the early 80s, throughout that famine, Ethiopia was exporting soy and linseed to Europe to feed to agricultural animals. And the same thing happened with the famine in Somalia, where roughly 1 million people died in the early 1990s. They were exporting soy and linseed and other agricultural crops to Europe. And there are obviously sociopolitical issues at work as well, and those are important to address. But especially as we become a more and more global economy, it's just a fact that those of us in the West, if we're eating a high meat diet, the chickens we're eating are in competition for grain and soy and wheat, both the land and the crops, with people who are starving. And just like we have budgets, everybody has budgets, and if something is too expensive, people can't buy it.
Awesome, thank you, Bruce. Next question. Many people who cut meat out of their diet continue to eat fish. Would you elaborate on the sustainability, ethics, and health of eating fish? And is there a difference in these considerations between farmed versus wild fish? So I think that could be for both John and Bruce.
Well, we are fishing out the oceans, and that's a fact. I mean, my company spent a lot of time and a lot of research trying to find the sustainable fish, and we've we've eliminated what Monterey Bay Aquarium, for example, says the red unsustainable fish, and that's cut a lot of inventory out. But increasingly, less and less species are available. Our ability to hunt fish is so sophisticated now, they just really don't have a chance. And so now it's about humans not overfishing it, but we have this challenge of the commons, right? Because the fish are out there in the commons, and you have to have quotas, and we have to have ways to limit that if it's going to be sustainable. Farm fish is one of the solutions. Unfortunately, farm fish have a lot of the same ethical issues that farmed animals have. They're pinned together. They have unhealthy diets. The well-being of those farm fish are not very well accounted for. So if I had more time, I'd tell you what, I don't want to do a commercial for what Whole Foods does, but we take that very seriously. It is an important issue. But fish is, it's exaggerated, the health benefits of fish. They are not the wonder kind, and they tend to be bioaccumulators of PCBs and mercury as well. So you have to watch out for fish.
Yeah, on the health issue, is there anybody here who would go out to the nearest body of water and dip a cup in there and drink it? I mean, but if you're eating fish, you're eating, you're basically involving yourself in a situation that's not that different from that. And if you Google fish health, there's actually something called fish fog. And it's what John was just talking about. It's the mercury and the PCBs and the other stuff in fish that can rot your brain, and it can rot your brain pretty quickly. There was a front page piece in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago about this kid who was a star quarterback and an honors student, and he thought he should eat tuna in order to be healthy. So he was eating a couple of cans of tuna every single day for the health benefits, and he ended up in remedial classes and unable to catch a football that was, even just sort of tossed to him. So in terms of the health problems of meat that John was talking about with regard to heart disease and obesity and cancer and everything else, all of that is fairly long-term. The adverse impacts of fish consumption can happen pretty quickly in terms of fish fog and other problems. From a sustainability standpoint, John just talked about that. The Nature article from 2014 that does a sort of product by product comparison of CO2 equivalent. So that's the one that says soy and legumes is 2 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per calorie for legumes and 54 for chicken. For fish is second to cattle. And if memory serves, it's like 160. So 3 times worse, basically, even than chicken. So environmentally, really a problem. And then fish are not swimming vegetables. There is a lot of very interesting ethological work that's been done with fish, and they have long-term memories. They are similar to mammals and birds in terms of their cognitive and their behavioral and their emotional sophistication. They are interesting individuals. Sylvia Earle is probably the foremost living marine biologist, and she'd be as famous as Jacques Cousteau if she were male instead of female. She said, I would no more eat a fish than I'd eat a Cocker Spaniel. They're interesting individuals. They hurt when they're wounded, and it really doesn't get any more expert than that. So for all 3 reasons, we probably should have spent more time on fish, limited time, but thank you very much for the question.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to ask the audience to stay seated while we just have a few wrap-up announcements. And first, let's give a round of applause to the speakers again.